Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Hamaker. I am Associate Director at PGAV Planners, and I am meeting you all for the first time, I think, because I was on maternity leave. So I am back now, and I'm going to be the person you all see at these meetings moving forward. And I have a couple of other folks with me. Lindsay, who I think many of you have met. Sarah, maybe you've met. Sarah's a planner with us. She's been digging into a bunch of the data. And then Jessica here is one of the engagement consultants. So she's getting ready for the public meeting and all of that. So you will.
Sorry, Catherine, can we just shift one of the microphones closer to you? So that way, sometimes
It'll pick it up.
Just want to make sure it's on there for Zoom. Sure.
Okay, that sounds great. So before we really get into the meat of the meeting today, if we could go around and have you all introduce yourself and just sort of tell me what hat you all wear related to the city of Clayton, that would be great. Go ahead.
John Brazil, I'm representing the school district.
Jeff Leonard, just an interested citizen.
He also is our sustainability.
Oh, yeah, I forget about that. Yes, I do have a hat. You're right. Actually, I wear a hat a lot.
I'm Betsy Malin Smith. I am just an interested citizen. Thank you for the verbiage.
I'm Bridget McAndrew. I'm the Ward 3, one of the Ward 3 elder persons. I'm also the aldermanic liaison to the planning commission. So that's
Great. Awesome.
Alex Berger, sometimes known as David Crosby. And I've just lived here all my life and I'm very committed to this community.
Steve Lichtenfeld, Plan Commission Chairman.
Bob Denlow, Planning Commission, and a real estate attorney specializing in eminent domain.
Brian Helly, planner with the city. Obi Croft, planning tech with the city.
It's open if residents would like to watch.
I
so
see.
we
Okay,
have some-
great.
We have some resident guests.
That sounds great. Okay, well, let me go. Okay, so this is the agenda we've got for today. We're gonna review some of the information we've started digging into, and we'll stop kind of at each section and have some time to discuss, get your thoughts, see if anything shocked you, see if there's anything that's like particularly interesting you want to know more about. And then we'll talk about kind of the next steps. So you all meet a bunch of times throughout the process. This time is kind of an interim step while we're digging into the data. And then the next time we come with you, the existing conditions report will be done. So this is your chance to kind of see what's been discovered so far and give us your thoughts so that we can make sure everything gets wrapped back into it. What you're going to see today is just some interesting tidbits of all of the information there is to look into. So some of it you may express interest in learning more, and we've already done that. And for other things, it might direct some of the work that we do. So get excited for some interesting data. Okay, so the first thing that we did was look into the past plans. So the city of Clayton has a lot of plans that have happened over the past many decades, some of which I hear you all were involved in past lives wearing different hats for the city of Clayton. Some of them are very useful and provide some interesting insight into things that have happened in Clayton or maybe things that haven't. Some of them are perhaps less relevant because they saw a future of Clayton that doesn't look at all like what the city looks like today. So we're going to run through a few of them and just give you some kind of high level things that were important about these. Again, in the existing conditions report, there's kind of a thorough review of everything that these plans said and if they involved engagement, what residents at the time wanted to see, all that kind of stuff. So what you'll see here is just a kind of an overview. So the first one that we really dug into because it's in the more recent past is the 1975 plan. So this one really called for more community facilities and park space. And it was one of the first plans to really focus on the downtown area and what the downtown could do to differentiate Clayton from many other communities here and really focused on street improvements. And so this was also the first of a couple of plans that really focused on automobile transportation. So didn't have a real focus on transit or walkability for the city. The 1989 plan was really just an update of that previous plan. So the city came together and said, you know, our previous plan's about 15 years old. It's time for us to update that. This one focused a lot on parking. So I'm sure parking is something that everybody talks about in every community, but it is of note here in Clayton especially, and you can see that date back quite a few decades. But this one actually was one of the first discussions about bikes. So this plan talked about an inventory of bike routes and thinking about how Clayton could be better connected to both the green spaces within Clayton and green spaces right outside your city limits. Then you had the 1993 plan for the central business districts. And so this one did focus on downtown Clayton, but also acknowledged that you all have some other commercial corridors and sort of commercial nodes throughout your community. Noted 17 what they called action areas, which again were kind of places where people were gathering in the community. So outside of the downtown area, where are those other places where community members gather? It also provided some recommendations related to incentives and how the city could be using its financial tools. Activating the downtown through retail, which is an interesting one because that then continues to show up in every plan after that. And then creating a redevelopment committee, and then those overlays first shows up in this plan as well. And then we're getting more into the sort of recent history that you all may have been involved in the 2010 downtown master plan. This was really focused on, again, that retail, the activating the first floors of the buildings, organizing downtown into individual areas that might have maybe differing character from each other. Focused on new connections, creating new civic spaces, some of which have happened, the connections to Shaw Park. And then this is actually the first time that encouraging real residential growth in the downtown area begins to be a focus for the city. So they've identified some areas to do that and some strategies that help to encourage that. And so that's probably maybe the most important thing about the 2010 plan is really that focus on the residential development in the downtown area. And then a couple of more recent plans, the future plan from 2012. This was really a strategic plan for the city, so it's much more targeted, related to what the city had control over, as opposed to sort of bigger picture things related to the city. And then the housing study, which is a really interesting one because it pointed to the need and the demand for multifamily housing in downtown, which this is one that many of the steps that this study called for have been taken. You can see a lot of the actions that were identified there have then come true in the 8 years afterwards. And then, okay, the parking study. So this is an interesting one. The parking study had some findings that perhaps will not surprise you, that there is surplus parking in downtown, but it's not in places that people want, or that there is parking, but people are unwilling to walk as far, that the parking is really utilized most by office workers. And then when the office workers aren't here, maybe the folks that come at night don't know how to utilize the parking and they don't know how to get to it. It had some recommendations regarding creating some sort of different parking requirements, considering the type of business or the time of day the parking might be used. There were also some recommendations related to employee parking. A lot of communities, they encourage employees to park in a certain place, restaurant employees, for example, so that the prime parking spots are available for the patrons. So a lot of recommendations related to that. And then the 2020 Strategic Economic Development Plan really focused for the first time in Clayton's planning history on the multimodal, the different kinds of ways that people could travel through and to Clayton other than the automobile. So there's a big focus on walkability, on making sure the community was safe if you were biking, and then thinking about how transit relates to Clayton. Okay, I'm going to pause here. Yes.
When you were looking at all those various plans, did you take a look at the context that we sit in, our surrounding communities and the overall metro? One that I can think of right away, I think it was around 93, the Galleria opened, and that changed our retail dramatically in a very short time.
Right. Yes, that's a good point. So, Clayton is, not unique in that it's surrounded by other communities, but unique in that it is it's got a downtown. It's a little bit different than many of your surrounding communities. because of its mix of uses. And so thinking about how it's impacted by those other communities, I think is a really important thing, but then also the reverse. So how does Clayton impact those other communities? Because you are the place that 35,000 of them come every day for work and, you know, thinking about those aspects. So I think that's a really important part of making sure we understand the context of Clayton.
Thank you.
Other thoughts about the past plans?
Sure.
You find the actions around those topics from the previous plans consistent, continuous, helpful with kind of where we are now. Of course, they inform, but interesting because it feels like the same themes are being formed, frankly, 70 years. Go back to the 50s.
Yeah,
Because it's just, if it's been the same themes over decades, why haven't we been able to solve it decades ago?
totally. So I think that there are clear things from not all plans, but some of the plans that then led to implementation and then did really impact the built environment here in Clayton. I think the housing study is one perfect example of the housing study proved that there was demand and room in the market for multifamily units. And since that, you all have added quite a few multifamily units. And so some of the plans have been much more actionable than others. The strategic plan is a little bit more big picture and a little bit more, here's some themes that we'd like to see for our city. So I think that is a really important part of the comp plan, is making sure that it is very actionable so that in 10 years, you guys, it's not just a list, another one on the list of plans. A comp plan is unique because it is long-term and kind of big picture. But then it also includes that future land use plan, which is intended to guide the zoning decisions that you all make. And so it is supposed to be very specific also. And so we kind of have to thread that needle with the comp plan to make sure it's big picture and visionary and maybe ties in some of those themes that other plans had, then also very concrete and specific. And so you can make sure it can guide the physical, the built environment. So that's something to keep in mind throughout this process, making sure we do both sides of that.
I wonder too, like in the sense that, you know, we're having all this building for residential, and that's because people tell us over and over again, if you want retail, you have
Right.
to have residential. So I think that kind of drives it, and residents tell us all the time, I want more retail in town. So, you know, I guess we'll have to see if that comes to fruition.
Yeah, part of some of the data that we're going to get into was looking at how many people, we use this data source that helps us, it's a little big brothery, but track how many people are in a certain location at any given time. And so we did some analysis into what that looked like in pre-pandemic and then what that looks like now, particularly focused on people here during the day. And so, you know, a lot of your office buildings are fully leased. And in a lot of places, that's an indicator of how many people are here. But with 50% of people working from home, it's not necessarily an indication of how many people are here.
Sure.
And so that's something we're really interested in during this process, is figuring out how many people are actually here. So we could figure out, well, you know, maybe it's, you have a fully leased office environment, but that's still not enough to support the, you know, convenience store or whatever it is that people want to see, that retail service. And so how can we figure out what that sweet spot is of how we can get more people here? Because it's clearly not office space, you know, what is that thing? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving a little bit to the next section. So this next section looks at demographics. So what's the population of Clayton? What's that looked like? You can see that you all have grown in the last 10 years by almost 8%, which is quite a bit more than so for the purpose of this analysis and a lot of the numbers, we looked at the 5-county region, which includes St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and then the 3 counties to the west. Because we just wanted to look at the adjacent communities. Looking at the full MSA paints a little bit different picture, and it is a little bit hard to compare, just because it is so big compared to Clayton, which is relatively small. And so that's, some of the numbers are compared to your more similar county, 5-county area. So again, you all gained about 1,200 residents in that 10 years. A lot of that's due to new residential development, also due to the fact that Clayton was a desirable community that people chose to move to, as opposed to some of those other places in the 5-county region. Over half of these residents were added to the downtown area, which is quite a few for a community of your size. We also looked at the age of residents. So this chart is interesting. If you all can see it, Clayton is in the green, and then that 5-county St. Louis region is in the gray. So you can see that your population skews really highly towards millennials. So for, according to that, that's 27 to 42-year-olds right now. Millennials are that old. And so that's a pretty noticeable difference compared to the 5-county region. You all have a lot more of those people that are maybe in the young children, family age of life. It's not particularly shocking given, your quality of life you offer here, the schools, that kind of thing, but it does differentiate you quite a bit from some other communities just because it is a lot higher. In terms of the household structure, so I actually found this to be particularly interesting, which is why we're showing it to you, but 37% of residents live in 1-person households here, which is a lot. That's a lot of people living by themselves. That's all kinds of people. That's people living in studio and 1-bedroom apartments in downtown that may fall in that millennial category. That could be older adults living alone now that their spouse is gone. It could be a wide variety of kind of lifestyles, but it is quite a few people living in one person households, and would have ramifications in terms of the housing style that you might need, or the housing style that might make sense for a big portion of your population. The average household size is 2.2. So you can see that the 1-person households are balanced out by families that then meet in the middle at that 2.2 number. Families with children are most likely found in those census tracts. The city of Clayton is 4 census tracts. And so if you look at census level data, that's as deep as you can get. And then 50% of adults are living with a spouse. So if residents are living in a 2-person household and with someone else, they are more likely living with a spouse than, say, a roommate, for example, which again, if you think about what kind of a 1-bedroom apartment would be suitable for either one person or a person and their spouse. And so thinking about what that means in terms of the real estate picture here. The racial and ethnic diversity. So same thing with this chart. Clayton is in the green. You can see that Clayton actually has roughly the same percentage of minority population as that 5-county region. It's about 30%, but it's made up by a different group. So Clayton has a much higher percentage of Asian residents than the 5-county region as a whole, less Black residents, less Hispanic residents, but an interesting kind of comparison that it's about this as diverse in terms of white residents versus minority residents, but the makeup is a little bit different, which also has some interesting ramifications on, 12% of Clayton's residents are foreign born. That is more than twice the percentage of that 5-county region, which was shocking to me. I would have guessed Clayton had more foreign born residents than other places, but I would never have guessed that it was twice as much. It also means that more than 8% of residents speak an Asian or Pacific Islander language at home instead of English, which again was shocking to me and an interesting thing when you think about planning for the community. The income is quite a bit higher than the region and is also increasing at a faster rate. The city is home to more people making $10,000 or less or $150,000 or more. Now the $10,000 or less number is likely your student population. So yeah, it's the students that live just off campus that are maybe not working, or if they're working a work study job or something.
What about the students that live on the WashU South 40?
Yes, so
Were
they're
they included?
Yes, so when the census counts people where they're living, so college students are counted at their college address. That's something to keep in mind because it would skew, the age younger, the people living alone, that kind of thing.
So the housing has basically stayed the same for decades around here. And yet I understand the school population has dropped, right? Has dropped. Okay. And it's dropped by how much?
Can you get your mic?
It's declined by 300 over the past 5 years.
Okay. And we don't have a big school district, so I guess that represents something. 300.
Yeah, it's the smallest it's been in 30 years, but
Right. So Clayton's value is largely, or at least significantly determined by a viable, desirable school system. Keeps our values up and, there's nothing bad to say about it. You guys have done terrific. Okay.
Number 1.
And now I understand for many reasons, the marketplace is turning downtown Clayton into a high-density residential living area. I think that's where our growth is, together with a bunch of hotels. And that will probably continue. The next thing I notice is that instead of condos, the marketplace is building a lot of apartments, which means easier entry, but high monthly rents for Clayton. So families can come in. My question is, we need to keep, when I look at the development plan, you need to keep the school district viable. And the high density living is desirable in many places, assuming that there's nice public space, places to walk to, et cetera, which is another topic. My question is, do we have any kids living in downtown with I don't see any, but what do I know? And should that not become a priority, figuring out how to make downtown Clayton, since we're turning it into a residential neighborhood, we should be supportive of it in many ways, but also with in mind to keep our school population up.
Interestingly, our kindergarten enrollment is up substantially this year. The first time in several years.
Good. But the point remains, we do need to, since we are bringing residential, I hate to just see young couples or really old couples or old single people occupying the space who will never support the school system and make into a viable neighborhood with children. That's my point.
I'm certainly agreeing with your point, but I think there's another point to be considered. Could we go back to the demographic population? So most of us in the category called baby boomers, we don't have any kids at home. And we may be the homeowners. But what we do know, that's a point. Point B is what we do know from the Morton May memory is that our residential property value is driven by the school district's reputation and rating, and that the business community's different tax rates supports our school district, which allows them to be what they are from a financial point of view. There's so many variables to this.
I don't deny it, but everything you said is on all fours. My point is, as the market is driving our Clayton downtown into a residential neighborhood, a mixed neighborhood. I mean, the fantasy is you live there, you walk to work, you walk to a restaurant, and you get an ice cream at night. You know, that's the fantasy that we all like to believe in. And we want a viable business. But the truth is, the market has changed the business community a lot. It's shrunk it. And for the foreseeable future, it's really ironic. New York's and San Francisco's are following St. Louis and the Pittsburghs and the Cincinnati's, since we have already gone through for a couple of decades now converting commercial to residential, and they're just now getting on the train to do that. But I agree with everything you say, but I'm looking at the marketplace, and if we're a comprehensive plan, we want to stay in front of it. And what kind of downtown do we want? And one anchor we always have to keep in mind is, what about our school system and what about the population?
Yeah, I think that's an important note. Maybe we can connect to see if there's any data we can get from you all as part of this process to think about, because I'm not sure that we know how many students that are enrolled or could potentially be enrolled live in the downtown area, but it would be interesting to see if we could figure that out.
Very few are coming from apartments.
I'm sure.
Including the Morelands.
I don't have data that specific. I'll have to look that
Know what
up.
I'm talking about when I say the Morelands? I thought that was a rental portion of the second district is a rental area with children going to Glenridge. And Glenridge individual grades were at their maximum. Proved this year versus prior. but I've got that somewhere in my brain.
I'll dig into that.
Great, I'm gonna keep us moving along. The next sort of category is land use, and so part of what we've done is figure out what exists today in terms of land use. You know, if we're thinking about planning for the future and what future land use should look like in Clayton, we've really got to start with what it looks like now. And so this is the breakdown of what that map depicted
Oh, wow.
in terms of how land is used within the city limits. So you can see 46% is residential, 8% commercial, 1% mixed use, 15% institutional. Parks, Recs, and Green Space is 6%, and then right of way is 23%. Which seems like a lot, but that is actually relatively standard. It's roadways and the Metrolink line and rail, you know, all of that. It feels like a lot, but it is a relatively standard number for most. So, churches, universities, all the county buildings, city, schools, all of that would fall in there. So that's how it adds up to so much.
Catherine, how does our park use compare? A lot of parks, but I don't know.
Yeah, so 6% is kind of low. However, that doesn't acknowledge that Clayton is right in the middle of all kinds of other communities that have parks. So you all are literally adjacent to Forest Park. And so it would be sort of silly to not acknowledge that your citizens have access to parks outside of your city limits. So you all have more parks, for example, than the city of Richmond Heights, an adjacent community. In terms of park access, your residents have tons of park access. It just sometimes means going outside of your city limits.
They also feel like we have a lot of smaller,
True.
that makes that percentage a little bit lower. So I would wonder the quantity of
Right.
parks and what areas they, like what percentage of our neighborhoods are within that kind of highlighted walkable access to
Totally.
parks versus just the size of parks.
Yeah. And that'll, that map would be in your existing conditions kind of analysis. If you basically put a 10-minute walk shed from every single park, what, would there be any houses that wouldn't be covered? Would there be any places you could live in the city of Clayton there, if you walked 10 minutes, you couldn't reach a park? Because that would acknowledge the folks that might walk to Forest Park or that might walk south. All right. So the next big category is housing and those kind of quality of life things that make this place a nice place to live. You can see here, these are the residential areas of the community. So about 46% of land is used for residential. 82% of that land is occupied by single family housing. You know, single family housing is on bigger lots. It's not as an efficient use of land, so that's why it takes up more of it. 37% of the buildings were built before 1939, which is quite a bit. And if you look on the map of building age, you know, they get newer as you go west into the city, away from the city of St. Louis, you know, as it developed. Clayton has a higher concentration of those multi-unit buildings than other communities in the region. Only about 34% of housing units are single-family detached units. So while they take up 82% of that residential land, only 34% of them are those single-family units. Again, that's because they take up a lot of space, just because of the nature of housing size and then how big the lots are. 56% of your housing is owner occupied, 44% renter occupied.
Does that include Washington U,
No, that wouldn't.
the dorms that you
That
counted
wouldn't
earlier?
include- No, that wouldn't include the dorms. I can confirm.
If you just do offhand, that's all. That seems pretty high, 44% renter occupied.
Well, so it would be housing units. So again, you can think about a single family housing unit taking up a lot of room versus one building that might have 50 units in it, all of which are rented. And then more than 75% of units have 2 bedrooms or less. That is pretty consistent with thinking about how many households you have that are 1-person households, for example. Just multifamily. Mhm.
Can I ask you a question? I'm sorry, this
Okay.
might go back to when you first described the 5-county region measurement. Is that like, Is that a compilation of everybody in the 5 counties surrounding? So we're measuring ourselves versus
Average.
an
all
average of that.
those. Mhm.
Okay, so
Yes.
if we. So the 5 counties includes west of us.
So it would include St. Louis
This?
City, St. Louis County, Jefferson County, St. Charles County, and
Franklin,
Franklin County.
Okay, and this is a good, like, cause in my mind, I'm thinking about measuring against communities that are right around us. Cause I feel like the 5 county region kind of dilutes things a little bit. Tell me again what the rationale was behind.
Yeah, so
that.
it's tricky in terms of, market data, for example, it might be helpful to compare to the housing cost in Richmond Heights, for example.
Right,
Which we would do in the report. When you think about something like, household size or some of these other metrics that are so, because Clayton is so small, it doesn't necessarily make sense to compare it to a community adjacent, but we kind of, I don't know, how would you explain?
just feels like it's a very different community than like a St. Charles or something, and I don't know if this makes us look better or worse but it just doesn't, I don't know how I feel about that comparison.
I wonder if we picked like I think the hard part is to choose one to compare for all of the
Right,
categories,
that's
right?
the trouble.
But if we said like, we really love this aspect of Fallon, Missouri, for example,
Right.
and we could compare where we fall in the data related to that aspect of Fallon compared to where they are, it might be a little bit more meaningful for that like
Right.
one specific
Yeah.
comparison. I think
Yeah.
that is kind of what
Yeah,
you're
so
saying.
it gets
Yeah.
tricky for me to like compare everything against this bigger thing when I'm like, I feel like that makes us look better maybe than we are because we're comparing to these other communities that really don't have the same kind of makeup or density or,
Totally.
no,
I see what you mean. I
feels
think
tricky.
when you're thinking about, I think there definitely are data points and indicators that make sense to compare with specific communities like Anna was mentioning. I think things like, the foreign-born population, for example, feels like if you're comparing a person that was born in another community, they're probably picking in that 5 county area, where should I settle? And they decided on Clayton. And so I think the comparison for that indicator, for example, wouldn't necessarily make sense to compare to Kirkwood or, insert other community. Go ahead.
It's a really interesting question though, and I think it's really good that you,
Back and forth.
well, that you brought it up because it's part of what I think we're trying to do is understand where we fit in the region. And that region is a very broad region. If you're moving here from Boston, you're going to say, well, across this whole space, where can I find a place that feels right to me? And these data points and metrics, I think, help crystallize, oh, well, Clayton as a community is this thing versus a whole bunch of others. If you're really focusing on people internal to the St. Louis region, then I think the more proximate comparisons really matter. Is it like, well, I know I'm after something like X. Am I going to get that more in Richmond Heights or Maplewood or Clayton or Ladue? I'm thinking like that. They're both helpful.
I would argue that if you're moving from Boston, like the lifestyle and the culture gets dramatically different as you move west. So I don't know. That also feels tricky.
Yeah,
I feel like you're still looking within the St. Louis County catchment area, but maybe I'm just biased.
I think people coming in here without a grounding of what the St. Louis region is like is very quickly going to use this sort of data to zero in on a place like Clayton.
Yeah, okay. I got it.
Definitely a worthwhile discussion that we all had. We started really big with the MSA, the 15 county, and then that seemed very big. And we started to think like, okay, nobody's going to consider these places on the Illinois side and then end up in Clayton, and so we did try to whittle it down to as small as we could without losing the comparison. But I definitely think that there are certain indicators, and if things come to mind over the next few weeks that you're thinking about, that might be useful to know in comparison to another nearby community, definitely let us know.
Thank you for backtracking on that. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
of course. So the next piece is housing affordability. So nearly 2/3 of homes in Clayton are valued at more than $500,000. So in that 5-county region, it's only 9%. So that's an example of one. If we compared it to Ladue, your numbers would look really different compared to that. And so, because the real estate market operates at that bigger scale, it is important to know how you fit compared to the region. But, then if you're only looking at schools of a certain quality, that would whittle it down even more. So it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
Each of these.
Yeah, that's my lens on it, is talking about families and schools and thinking about home prices and who's living in them and who wants to,
Right.
make their money when they sell it. I think that, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the tricky or maybe interesting thing is if you were comparing a person that was moving to your community or thinking about other communities where they could get a similar style of house with a similar school quality, we might pick something like Ladue, as a comparison. But if you were a young professional looking for a place for near transit that you could have a lively nightlife or whatever, we would not be comparing to Ladue, we would be comparing to a different community. And so that's why you've got to kind of pick and choose depending on the indicator to see what you're trying to get at. And you can see a couple of charts here to see the median home sale price and the typical home value. You can see that home values have continued to increase, single family homes in particular in Clayton. The median rent is about almost $1,500, which is quite a bit more than the region average. Again, if you compared it to a different one, it would be closer, but something to keep in mind. In terms of some quality of life things, Clayton is a very safe community. There's far lower violent crime rate here than the regional average, and then even more if you compare to the state or compare to the city of St. Louis. But there is a pretty high larceny rate here. That's not necessarily the same kind of quality of life indicator. It's more an issue for visitors and people that are coming to downtown Clayton than anything else. The education indicators are all great. People love the public schools here. They're ranked very highly. It's a reason a lot of people move into the community. The census data for the education numbers here in Clayton does get a little bit skewed because it does include the university students that technically live in Clayton according to the census, but are at private institutions. And so we were digging into the public versus private school attendance, and that really does skew the numbers. Most people in K through 12 attend public schools here, but if you throw in anything higher, you get a way higher percentage of private school attendance because you're getting all those college students here. Any thoughts about those indicators before we keep moving? All right, let's keep going. So the next one we started digging into is the economy and commercial development and everything happening in your community. You can see here, there's some sort of nodes of commercial areas throughout the city outside of downtown. There's the Demond area and some other corridors in the community that have a concentration of businesses. They all have kind of a different character, different type of business, find success there. Various kind of futures you could imagine for these different areas. So something to keep in mind as we keep thinking about this. About 34,000 people work in the city of Clayton, and 98% of them come from outside of the city. So there's not a ton of people that live and work in Clayton. It's a lot of inflow every day to come to work here, which is, I'm sure, not terribly shocking for you all. As an employment center, you can see some of the representation of different industries in Clayton versus the region. This is one where I think the region makes a lot of sense because industries have a lot of regional representation. So you can see Clayton has a ton of jobs in finance and insurance compared to the region, but way less in healthcare, for example, which makes perfect sense. You can think about the healthcare centers of our region. They're not here. So things like that help to think about what kind of industries make sense to continue adding to the community, to continue building upon strength, that sort of thing. So the post-COVID office market. So there's a lot of research and data that has been done around what to do with downtown Clayton post-COVID and what it means for the office market. So you all have a ton of square footage of office space. In the 10 largest office buildings, your occupancy is about 81%, which is not bad. It's a lot better than many other places. But some, room to improve, I would say. 61% of office space is Class A office space, which means the rest is not Class A office space, which means there perhaps is some additional office space that is not what people are looking for. And so thinking about reuse potential of those, what makes sense to do with those office spaces if they're not, if people are consolidating office, then the sort of the least attractive of the office spaces is gonna probably remain empty. So thinking about reuse there. Significantly higher lease rates than the region overall. It's a lot more expensive to have office space here, and yet people continue wanting it.
But it started declining in 2017. So I'm guessing that was when Centene came online and those buildings were not full. I mean, how do you account for that?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we have been looking into this. I mentioned it at the beginning, this foot traffic thing, which doesn't actually, you don't have to be on foot to be counted in this, but the idea of who's actually here versus what's happening with the offices in terms of leases. And so if you pre-pandemic, there were about 25,000 daily visits to downtown, 25,000 people were coming to downtown, and 62% of those were non-employees. And so and non-resident visitors. So people that are coming here to pay their traffic ticket or to eat lunch, or, it could be any of those things. And so that 25,000 is kind of that was the success pre-pandemic that we would maybe be trying to get back to in terms of numbers. So that number dropped by 46% at the pandemic when people stopped coming to work here and stopped visiting here. And today we're at 73% of that original 25,000. And so quite a bit has come back in the couple of years since the initial drop. And interesting, the resident foot traffic continues to grow. So it's 66% greater than it was pre-pandemic. So,
We're starting off at 1% of
Yeah.
all traffic.
Yeah,
Right. So. I mean,
exactly. But it's who knows why that is? Maybe it's because people were at home way more and they came to appreciate the fact that they could walk to downtown Clayton to eat lunch, and now they do that way more. Or, it could be, go ahead.
But there are more people living in downtown also, which
True.
may be more walkable
Explain it,
than
yep.
elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Do you have the same splits for what it looks like today in terms of non-employee, employee residents?
Yes. I just gave you some snippets of this, but I don't think I have them with me,
Okay.
but we could send it to you for sure.
Are you going to hand out these at the end?
I did bring some if you'd like it. Yes. I didn't want you to read ahead.
Okay.
If I could just address the foot traffic, I think to understand the comprehensive plan, follow the foot traffic. You want a viable area? Tell me how many people are outside walking on the sidewalks. Downtown, on the planning commission, we build all these high rises, mostly residential, a few hotel. Sometimes Maveration, the new commerce tower that we build, but basically the market has moved us to apartments. It'll be that way for foreseeable future. It may go to condos. We'll never have retail come to downtown Clayton. Marketplace has completely obliterated that for the foreseeable future. We had a project before us recently, and the developer built, I think that was the condos, and first floor was retail. We got the loan, says the developer, assuming it'll be zero occupation of the first floor.
But they're gonna have the dedicated space. No one's gonna be in it.
It'd look all over Clayton. That's typical. First floors are empty. You get restaurants, they turn over. You get a dentist down at the end, something like that, but not what we would hope for. And that's driven by the market. My point is, if we want to create what I think the comprehensive plan should really be all about, is setting priorities. First priority should be making a viable downtown Clayton that has character and soul, instead of just agreeing to build high rises that look at each other. The architecture is never going to draw people, never. Downtown St. Louis has interesting architecture, but we're going to build clean looking glass buildings and just look around. I haven't had anybody who's gone through Clayton downtown and said, oh man, that is beautiful character. To create an interesting character and soul for downtown Clayton, you need to bring people out. I just came back from Romania 2.5 weeks. And they have town centers that draw everybody. They'll have like fountains every night. All the people come there. There's kiosks, there's restaurants. Kirkwood Commons is so much farther ahead of us. If you want to make a successful Clayton, the comprehensive plan should do something like this. You know, that parking lot across from the administration center and across from the Zale, downzone it to a park. County can't sell it to a third party without us, if it's downzoned. I don't want to use the word downzone, rezone it. And we designate to the world that this will be our future town center, which will draw the residents, which will have the grandparents who live in these high rises, bring the children to like a little corner playground. I was in San Francisco the other month, and a big commercial park has this beautiful playground. Brilliant. And it's used all the time. Just brilliant. Another one, I was in a city in Romania, they have kiosks for foods and whatever. We don't have retail. We fill it with retail items, or maybe ice cream, or we have chess tables, or we have movable chairs instead of just benches in concrete. For those of you who do planning, you know, I see all this all the time. People have no reason to go outside in Clayton, except for dinner at most, and then they go back. Instead of retail, we're going to maybe have a jazz place. God, that's brilliant. You got to think of alternatives. What's going to bring people out to the streets to walk? And it's going to start with a town center where people can congregate, walk to, that's centrally located. It could be someplace else, but I think how to make Clayton viable should be the first, second, Clayton downtown viable should be the first, second, and third. We provide high density, nobody else does. A lot of people like high density, we're safe, and we got a great school district. That's enough to bring people into downtown Clayton if we plan it right.
That's right. Insert us. Yes, exactly. That's right. There you go.
Should have been music playing in the background.
That's right.
Don't hold back, please.
All right, I'm gonna power us through the last few, just because we only have a few minutes left. So we've got some data on retail. You all know you have a lot of retail space. The majority consists of small storefront spaces on the ground floor of buildings or in historic buildings. Your occupancy rates are pretty high. The market is healthy, but particularly downtown, it does rely on those office workers during the day. And so thinking about if the office environment is changing and only 50% of people are going to be in those office buildings moving forward, you know, what does that mean for supporting the retail environment? You know, maybe you need different uses, maybe you need smaller footprints, whatever that is, thinking about that for your new developments and then reuse of current spaces. You know, you've got a lot of hotel and office and apartment projects in the pipeline. And so how many of those people are going to be able to offset the office people? You know, it's another thing to keep in mind. The hotel market. So there's just over 1,100 hotel rooms in Clayton. Occupancy, you know, generally follows the same trend as the region overall. During the pandemic, obviously, there was a huge drop. It has come back. Clayton performs about 4% better than the region on the whole in terms of hotel occupancy. Average nightly rates are higher here though. And so despite having higher rates, you still seem to perform better than the average overall. Again, thinking about what that traffic from those hotel rooms means for supporting retail, supporting restaurants, all of that. Okay.
Hotel on the Forsyth curve.
Mhm.
Take a look at the cars parked outside.
And
Significant. There's a significant amount of people already in that hotel. And second hotel will be where the old police department was. Closer to the Metrolink. But you drive by on Forsyth, the curve, and you see all those cars parked on the street. Those are all people at that hotel.
When you, if you could go back 2 slides, one more, there. The last item, large hotel and apartment projects are likely to offset loss in office workers. That could be temporary with the projects, the apartment projects that are being built, but also the workers in the hotel may not be the type that would be able to actually live in Clayton, where office workers might be.
That's true. That's something to
So
keep in mind.
I'm not sure about the offsetting the loss in office workers.
So that actually is getting at the fact that the population staying in the hotels, living in the apartments would offset the daytime population of office workers as opposed to the workers
Oh,
building them. Yes,
okay.
yeah,
There's
sorry.
a
No,
big
you're fine.
difference.
You are fine. Okay, let me get through this last section. So the last section focused on transportation. So you all have all kinds of roadways, Metrolink, sidewalks, all kinds of ways that people move around Clayton. And so there's another sub-consultant on our team, WSP, that specializes in transportation. And so they have done a very interesting, very cool analysis of how people move from within Clayton. Thinking about how many people are coming here every day, how many people are leaving here, the people that are moving within the community, how are they doing that? Are they on a bike? Are they walking? Are they in their personal car? So interesting kind of tidbits are 38.6% of all trips starting in Clayton are less than 3 miles. So people that are starting from their home in Clayton are only going 3 miles. And so that's really not very far. That's probably further than you'd be willing to walk. That's a pretty manageable bike ride, depending on where you're going. That's a pretty quick transit ride. And so thinking about, a lot of those past plans, especially recently, a lot of the priorities the city has talked about have been embracing the walkability and the transportation assets you have. And so if you think about that 3 mile number as maybe the doable mode shift for people, it's going to be a lot to ask people to bike 15 miles. It's going to be a lot to ask people to find a different mode of transportation for those long trips, but for shorter trips, it might be a more doable transition. And so prioritizing what people are doing. And so there's some interesting analysis around the purpose of people's trips. So if they're traveling less than 3 miles, what are they doing on that trip? And is it a feasible switch to some other mode of transit? So interesting stuff to come.
Surprised by the public transit number.
Thought it'd be hard.
Mhm. Interestingly, when I asked that question to city staff, they were not shocked at all.
I'm not saying it's not accurate. It's just, I didn't know that number. And
Right. So a review of kind of the transportation assets you all have here. So you have 9.5 million square feet of pavement. 72% of it is owned by the city of Clayton. So that's roadways, sidewalks, et cetera. A lot owned by St. Louis County. Private owners is, people's driveways and all of that surface, and then some by MoDOT. The sidewalk and ADA ramp network is pretty robust. You can see on that map up there, it covers quite a few sections of the city. It's a pretty walkable community from that standpoint in terms of safe walkable options.
the city has done a great investment over the.
You said safe, walkable
Hmm.
options. When you go through the study, will you actually look at the safety of
Yes.
walkability, streets, bikeways, all of those?
Yes, we will. Yes.
Okay.
So we've
There
already
there
done.
are different perceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done a lot of analysis on the safety from the standpoint of where there are accidents, where pedestrian, bicyclist, and automobile. And so that's one way to kind of get a sense of where things are safe and where things are not safe. The condition of sidewalks, for example, is another way to find out where they're safe and where they're not safe. Thinking about the ways that people are traveling through your community. So what are the common streets that people are traveling through the community to get to parks, for example, or to get to things where they're more likely to be on foot or on bike is another way to think about assessing kind of your safety when it comes to walkability.
There be information, downtown obviously is where they're concerned just because.
Right.
So will you guys dive deeper or give us any recommendations?
Yes.
When I was in Asheville. At some of their busy intersections, they cross,
Mhm.
like people, so there are a few intersections and I don't know, that might be, it'd be safer
Yeah.
for.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're almost to the end. The accessibility by transit, obviously you all know you are transit rich in compared to many places in the region. You all have access to several bus routes, the MetroLink that connects you all to lots of different places and connects a lot of different residents to the city of Clayton. So that'll just be something we're thinking about throughout this process is how to, you know, maybe get that 1.2 number up a little bit in terms of people using transit to get to the city of Clayton. And also thinking about how it could create a better quality of life for maybe the people that want to live here and use that transit. Okay, I think that's the end of our data dive.